Let's configure our application to talk to Firebase. The first thing you need to do is to install Firebase, and we're going to use a library called angularfire 2, which is the official library for Angular projects. So you can do that with npm install Firebase and @angularfire/fire. And while it's installing, we can go back to our project and copy the configuration file, the API keys. Back in here, you just click on the web and copy this object. You don't need anything else. Now, back in our application, if you go to the folder environments and environment.ts, here we need to add a new entry called Firebase. You can name it however you like, but Firebase is a good one. And then you just paste that one in there. Now the installation is finished. We can go inside our app module.ts, and here we're gonna do some imports. And these imports will be regarding to the angularfire 2. So if you do a quick search for angularfire 2, it should get you the GitHub page. And here on the GitHub page, if you go on docs and then install and set up, here is all the configuration that we need to do. And we're gonna start by importing the angularfire module and the environment. And then we need to initialize the angularfire module. So that we get the environment and the Firebase object that we created in our environment here. Now, before we continue, let's import the other modules that we're going to use. So just below the angularfire module, I'm gonna paste these ones, which is the Firestore, Fire Storage, the auth module, and the functions. The functions as well, we're going to importing functions region token, and this is to configure the region of the functions where you want to store your functions. Now, just below the angularfire module, I'm going to paste the other imports. And as for the token, we need to add it as a provider. Here we have already the Ionic provider, so you can just paste this one in here. And because my project is in Europe, I'm gonna add Europe West 1. But if you go back to the configuration, here is how you're setting up what we did, setting up all the other modules and importing. Now to get the configuration for the functions, you need to go inside functions, functions MD. And here is how where you get that providers that we used as well. Now, as for the locations for functions, if you go on the docs from Firebase, guides, and then cloud functions, and there's a cloud functions location. And here on the locations, if you just scroll down all the way to the bottom, there are all the locations available. For the US, there's the multi-region, and I'm using the multi-region for Europe. So basically you should put your functions close to your customers, and so is your database. Now back in our application, with all this setup done, we can initialize Firebase. So I'm gonna open up the terminal. Now, we've installed Firebase and angularfire in our application. Now for us to be able to use the Firebase SDK, we need to install the Firebase tools. You can do that with npm install-g Firebase tools. And this will give us access to the SDK, which will allow us to deploy and create functions and do other stuff. Okay, the installation is done. Now we have access to Firebase. And this is the version I'm using. So Firebase, the first thing you need to do is to log in. And this will open a browser window, and you can add your logins over there. Okay, now we can close that one and go back to the project. So Firebase, if you do --help, you list all the available options that you can do. We did the login, and we can serve, you can open. Now, before we continue, let's build our application with npm run build. Now, if you take a look, that command converted all our TypeScript files into a nicely packaged, ready-to-go application for us to deploy. And if you take a look, all the files were created inside our www folder. This is our output, and it has everything about our app, Angular stuff, and there's also some source maps in here because we built it for development. So now let's continue with the initialization of Firebase. And I'm going to open the terminal again, and I'm going to do Firebase init. And this will ask which features you want to use. So let's go with Firestore, functions, hosting, and storage. Now we need to choose the project you want to use. I've created the ngblog-en. Now these are the names of the files for the rules and other things. So you can leave it as default, or you can change for something else that you want. I'm going to leave as default, and I'm also going to use TypeScript for the functions, and yes, for the tslint, and let's install it as well. Now for the public directory is this one that we created, our build folder over here. So www. If you're using like a normal Angular app, it defaults to dist, but because it's Ionic, they have the on configuration. You can also change that in the configuration. I'll show you in a bit. But now here's asking if you want to create a single page application, which is what we're doing. So this, we're gonna redirect every URL to our index so we can pick up our JavaScript. And let's say no, because this wants to overwrite our index that from our build. It wants to override with default Firebase placeholder page. So put no. And for the storage can be the same, and it's all done. This created Firebase RC with our default project. Create our rules files as well. Now to change, if you'd like to change the default output folder, you need to do that in the angular.json file. And this is the output path over here for the build. So if you change this, you also need to change here on the Firebase JSON, the public folder from the hosting. It also created a functions folder with a little index page over here as with the placeholder. I'm just gonna comment it out so it avoids some building errors next time we build without any functions. In the next lesson, we're gonna configure our deployment and do our first deploy.